Why don't more fountain pen makers have stub nibs as part of their lineup? Sigh. I know, right? Like, I feel ya. Stub nibs got a very special place in my heart. I think back, I get very nostalgic around the DC show. I know I'm bringing up the DC show a lot. It just happens, very fresh on my mind. But I think a lot about, like, man, what it was like for me to be a newbie, because I was a total newbie. That was my first just drop into the ocean of fountain pen experience. I literally never even touched a fountain pen before. I went to that show and it blew my mind. So whenever the DC show rolls around, it throws me right back into being a complete and total noob. And I remember that very, very, very fresh in my mind. So the reason stub nibs kind of come up in that thought process in my mind is because that was some of the first nibs that I was really drawn to was stub nibs, because for me, I did not have great handwriting starting out. I still don't think my handwriting's that great. It's got a little better, but it's not amazing. For me, the stub nib just like leapfrogged me into like a whole other category of what I thought was my own handwriting quality, visual appeal. And part of that is just the nature of a stub nib. It kind of makes it look more scripty, more calligraphic than a round nib, at least in my mind. I know I'm not the only one that feels that way. So for me, I'm like, yeah, stub nibs are awesome, but I experienced kind of the same thing. Like, stub nibs are not a standard nib offering on every single pen. I don't necessarily 100% know why that is, because it's going to be different for every manufacturer. The one thing I can say is that it's my understanding from talking to manufacturers that are from other countries outside of the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. market is where most of my influence comes from, because that's mainly who we serve with our customer base, but we also interact socially with people all over the world, and most of our manufacturers are outside of the U.S. So it's interesting to get kind of perspective on that. From what I understand, stub nibs are not necessarily the hottest demand thing. It's like, even in the US, it's changed a little bit, but like the medium nib for a long time was like the most popular nib. And to me, I'm just like, I got nothing wrong with the medium nib, but that is just not what I would say is like the go-to most popular nib size. And it does not typically prove to be the most popular nib size for us at Goulet. Usually extra fines, and or as fine as possible, because we have pretty terrible paper as a general rule in the US, because we typically have inkjet printers and things like that, or people using pencils or ballpoints. And so high quality paper is usually not the standard at most places that we're interacting in the US. So having a finer nib is usually the most popular nib size, if all else equal. And then a stub is usually like number 2 for us here at Goulet. Now, it's not the case for every pen necessarily, but that's usually kind of how it goes. And the manufacturers are usually pretty surprised to hear that. And we end up being somewhat of an anomaly. Maybe not just Goulet, with our kind of, whatever the demand that we have with our community, but it might be somewhat more even of a US thing than outside the US. So I think that's, and I think part of that maybe has to do with the handwriting style. Part of that has to do with, maybe just the novelty factor. Maybe it's because, it looks kind of more scripty and stuff like that, or it's a way to step up your handwriting a little bit. Maybe if you haven't, kept up with handwriting in a long time, it's certainly other cultures, the ones where fountain pens are coming from, Germany, France, Japan, Italy, things like that, there is more of an emphasis on handwriting in the culture, and kids in school are taught more handwriting and even use fountain pens in their schooling. That hasn't been the standard in the U.S. in a long time, even though historically historically handwriting was very important in the U.S., especially around the turn of the 20th century and all that, when you had Spencerian and Palmer and all that, who were huge influences, not just in handwriting, but kind of in society and morality in general. Like, there was a huge effort to push the quality of handwriting with morality and stuff like that. And take that for what it is. That was kind of a historical thing, but you know, I think that some of the appeal of having these stub nibs is maybe a little bit of a hearkening back to those times when really nice handwriting was kind of a status thing almost. So I don't know if that's necessarily the same thing in other cultures, or maybe like you can have nice handwriting without having to throw a calligraphic looking nib on it, but maybe that's kind of like a little life hack for us in the US. At least that's how I found it to be when I first started out in fountain pens. So for me, it was almost kind of a surprise that there weren't as many stub nibs available on everything. So this is just kind of casual ramblings that I'm having, not meant to make any, I'm certainly not super cultured internationally or historically. These are casual observations from the top of my head. But what I can say is that, you know, pretty much every conversation that I'm having with manufacturers and distributors and things like that, who are kind of people that have some influence on what products are offered within their lines, I am advocating for the demand and the interest in things like stub nibs, like flex nibs, like some of these more interesting nib offerings. So if that is something of interest to you, please continue to let us know at Goulet through whatever means, comments, emails, that kind of stuff. You know, just kind of as an ongoing basis, because the more specifically we know that and we can kind of advocate for that with specific brands, the more likely it is to maybe make that happen. So, and then what I can say is, like, breaking it down even more, usually the finer the stub, actually the more popular it is. Like a 1.1 is typically the finest that's offered for most brands. Some brands may have a 1.1 and a 1.5, maybe a 1.9, and it kind of decreases pretty drastically in demand the broader the stub gets. So that 1 millimeter to 1.1 tends to be kind of the sweet spot for most people.